when the ship struck the iceberg?
In the steerage class.
You were emigrating to America?
Yes. I was coming over here to my sister.
If I may ask, how old were you then?
I was 16, going on 17. Be 17 in October.
When did you first realize how serious the trouble was?
Oh, I didn't until I got to this country. I thought it was part of the trip, to tell you the truth. I didn't realize that there was any danger.
You didn't realize there was any danger?
No. I thought that was a pretty hard way to get here, but I didn't really think it was as bad as it was until after.
When the alarm was sounded, what happened?
Well, I was asleep at the time, and I thought then the ship had landed. So I thought we were here in this country.
Then you went up on deck?
And then I went up on deck, and then we were told to go down, that there was a piece of ice on deck, and that when they get it off of it, everything would be all right, to go down and go to bed.
How did you escape?
Well, we were standing on the steerage, third class they call it, and then we couldn't get up second. And of course then there was one man with us, and he was our guardian angel, and he said, for God's sake, let the women up. So at that I got up.
And then you
second.
And then you got into a lifeboat?
And no, then I had to go to first cabin. The lifeboats were only going from first cabin. So there was a man on the second deck, and he asked me to go on his shoulder, and I climbed over, and then I think it was the last boat that was going out.
Did you take it?
They didn't want to let me on because there was too many on the boat already.
But you got into the boat? But
I said to the man I'd like to go with my sister because there was a neighbor with me, and I thought he'd feel it. Because I didn't want to lose the crowd. I didn't really think it was any danger, but I thought I'd miss them in the dark. You know, it was very dark.
Did you see the ship sink?
Oh, yes. I was looking at it sinking when we were in the lifeboat, because we were in the lifeboats for 9 hours.
And then which ship rescued you?
Carpathia picked us up then early in the morning, about 9 o'clock or something. I think it was about 9 o'clock in the morning.
Look, I believe you were in charge of the Turkish bath on the Titanic.
I was.
And where were you when the iceberg hit the ship?
I was in bed.
And when did you first realize things were wrong?
Well, naturally the fog woke us up, and everybody got to their feet, and I went into a little passage, and I met the second steward, which was Mr. Dodd, and he said, for God's sake, get some clothes on, get up on deck. I said, what's wrong? He said, I don't know. So, of course, I had a coat on, a night dress, and we got up on deck, and everybody was most cheerful.
When did you first realize how serious things were?
I didn't think it was serious because I didn't think it was possible a big ship like that could sink. And everybody was busy, and they was lowering the lifeboats, and the crew were marvelous. Everybody was cheerful.
And how did you escape?
In the last lifeboat, and I didn't want to go.
And then, of course, you realized that things were very serious.
Yes, I did.
And did you see the ship sink?
I did. It sank very quickly.
That must have been a most dramatic sight.
It was, because you could just see the lights going down and down.
Did you hear the music playing?
I did.
Almost till the end?
Till the end, I heard them play, you know, Nearer My God to Thee.
Nearer My God to Thee.
And I met a steward, and he said, here you are, grab hold of this. And it was a baby. So I took the baby. And then when they lowered the last lifeboat, I didn't want to go. And they said that one of the other stewards, and Mr. Wheat, he was helping lower them, and Mr. Murdoch, he was the chief steward, and he was shouting out, ladies, children and women first. They was marvellous.
And you took the baby?
I took the baby, and I didn't want to go, so they said, come on. And I went down in the last lifeboat, and there was, I think there was 72 in it. And you could hear the ice crash in the sides of the boats.
You saw ice all around you?
Oh, yes. crashing, and the water, the ocean was as smooth as a pond.
And you were in the water until, you were in the boat until
the
daylight?
Yes, by daylight. And then we was brought on to New York, and the Lapland brought us back to Plymouth, the survivors, which had to come back. So then, of course, we was kept there a little while, and then brought on to Southampton. Of course, that was very sad, because everybody thought she knew somebody who was lost, and I had so many friends on there, and you couldn't tell them anything.
No impact as such. It was just like jamming your brakes on a car. And that was that. She stopped. We had a porthole open. I looked out, and the sky was clear, the stars were shining, the sea was dead calm. And I thought, I don't know, I couldn't understand it. So I came out of my cabin, and I thought, well, I'd go forward. And I went forward to the well deck on the starboard side, and I could see ice in the well deck. There's no sign of iceberg then, because she'd passed us. And the lights were shining on the water from the portholes, and no sign of damage above waterline. And of course, what had happened, we slipped over the iceberg. And although she was supposed to be unsinkable with a double bottom, the iceberg had cut her from forward on the starboard side to the engine room, right through her two bottoms. And we had orders to get the lifeboats out. And of course the order, the same old order, women and children. And we swung the lifeboats out and gradually filled them up. First boats were away on the port side. The first boats away didn't have many passengers on board. They were afraid to go down. There was a 70-foot drop to the water, and they didn't think she was going to sink. And a few of the first boats on the port side got away with half filled. Don't forget, we had 16 lifeboats, and they each carried 50. And if they'd been filled, we could have saved 800, whereas we only saved 500. So you can imagine there were many seats in the first lifeboats vacant. Then I had orders to go down the storeroom with a gang of men and get all the biscuits we could find. Well, when we got back up onto the boat deck, we couldn't get near the lifeboats. Some people were scrambling to get in, being pushed back. By that time, she was listing very badly to port, and we couldn't get the starboard boats down. But before I got my lifebelt on, I met a young couple, and I can tell you her name. It was Mrs. Clark. They'd spent their honeymoon in France, and we'd picked them up at Cherbourg. And she was having trouble with her lifebelt. So I fixed that on to her, and I said, I think you'd better get into a lifeboat. And there was one in the port, on the port side. So she said, no, I don't want to go there. I don't want to leave my husband. So I said, well, it's just a precautionary measure. You get in, your husband will follow later on. And I got her away, and that was that. And then I picked up my own lifebelt and put it on. Then the third-class passengers were coming up. There were 700 of them. And they swarmed the decks and filled up the decks. And I thought, well, I'd done all I possibly could. I'd helped them all I could. And I thought, well, now I'll go up and get out of all this scrumming and go on the poop deck. And she was sinking fast then. And all of a sudden she lifted up quickly, and you could hear everything crashing through her. everything that was movable was going through her. And then she went down and seemed to come up again. So I thought, well, now I'm going to leave. And I was hanging on to a board. We had 2 boards, starboard and port, which said, keep clear of propeller blades. And I was hanging on to one of these, and I was getting higher and higher in the air. And I thought, well, now I'll go. And I dropped in. I had a lifeboat on. And I hit the water with a terrific crack. Luckily, I didn't hit anything when I dropped in. There were bodies all over the place. And then I looked up at the Titanic. So the propellers were right out of water, the rudder was right out, and I could see the bottom. And then gradually she glided away, and that was that. That was the last of the Titanic. I didn't want to die. I mean, I didn't see much chance of living, but I was gradually getting frozen up. And by the grace of God, I came across a lifeboat, and they pulled me in. And there was a fireman dead in the bottom. There was about a foot of water in this boat. There was another man he seemed to be trying to get away from it again. I don't know what was the matter with him. They were tying him down. And the rest were women and children. And I sat on a seat, and I sat next to Mrs. Clark, the girl I'd put into a lifeboat. And she said, the first thing she said, have you seen my husband? So I said, no, I haven't. I expect he'll be all right. Anyway, I was in a pretty bad way then, as you can imagine. Frozen solid almost. And she wrapped me round with a cloak. She had some sort of blanket or a coat on. Anyway, I think she probably saved my life, I don't know. But I saved hers. At least I think I might have done. I think I did. And she saved mine. Then, first light, the Carpathia came along. Carpathia was about 7,000 tons, and they were going to the Mediterranean, absolutely loaded. And they took us all on board, took us to New York. That was that.
I believe you've even got a watch that you were wearing at the time when you went into the water.
Yes, yes, but I couldn't afford anything better in those early days. Here it is.
That says 2:20. What time was it when you went into the water, do you think?
I think about 2 o'clock. I think it lasted. It was frozen up like I was. I think it lasted for about 20 minutes in the water.
Does talking about this incident bother you like you have been today?
Talking about it? I should probably dream of that tonight. Have another nightmare. You'd think I'm too old for that, but you'd be amazed. You lie in bed at night and the whole thing comes round again.
Now let's take up the story from survivors of the Titanic themselves. First of all, an American passenger, Miss Edith Russell, traveling first class. Where were you just before it happened, Miss Russell?
In the library. The steward had just called out, 11:30, lights out. So I gave him a few letters to post in the morning, told him I'd pay for the stamps, picked up a book and walked forward to my stateroom, which was on the same deck, A11. And as I got in my stateroom, I switched on the electric light, and I noticed a slight jar, followed immediately by a second one, and a third one, which was quite strong enough to make me hold on to the bedpost. The boat came to a full stop. I walked forward to my window and saw a grayish-white mass drifting by. I was very much surprised and decided to take my fur coat and go out on deck and see what it was all about. Well, when I got out on deck, I noticed a gentleman standing by the rail and several people in a large, again, this grayish mass. I said, what on earth is that? That? Oh, madam, that's a lifeboat. That's an iceberg. Iceberg? Gracious, I've always wanted to see one of those things since I was a child. Well, you're seeing it, Corker, now. There's 1/8 above the water and 7/8 below, and believe me, that's some iceberg. So, after that, we picked up bits of ice, played snowballs for a little while, and it was very, very cold. I asked one of the officers if there was any danger. He said no, and I went back to bed.
As simple as that. No danger as far as you were concerned.
No danger.
Now, what about Mr. Witter, second-class smoking room steward? What did you think the Titanic had hit, Mr. Witter?
Well, I didn't think she'd hit anything. I thought she'd dropped a blade from the propeller, you know.
How did you find out what in fact had happened?
Well, I went down to the working alleyway where my cabin is, number 7 Glory Hole. I was standing there talking to 2 or 3 fellas, and Carpenter came along, and I heard him say, the bloody mailroom's full of water. I said, what's that shit, mailroom full of water? He said, yes. I said, well, what about those bulkhead doors forward? He said, they're not holding, Jim. Of course, then I walked into my cabin, number 7 Glory Hole, and I opened my box. I called everybody. I said, come along, fellas, get up, she's going down. So I opened my box, took out some matches, some cigarettes, and I said, come on, fellas, get out. What the hell are you talking about? They said, get out of here. And someone threw a boot at me. I said, good night, gentlemen. Just as easy as that.
As far as they're concerned, no danger either, not at that time. Well, now, Commander Lightholer, the second officer of the Titanic, died recently, but in 1936 he broadcast his story of that night. And it left 6 compartments open to the sea. The water flowed into the first 6 compartments forward of number 4 boiler room and caused her bows to sink so much that the water flowed over the top of the aftermost watertight bulkhead, filled the next compartment, then overflowed again into the next one, and so on. Well, from that moment, as the captain very well realized, nothing could save the Titanic, and the order was given, lower the boats. Quartermaster Rowe, who's here tonight, was a very surprised man. Where were you, Quartermaster?
I went on watch on the poop at 8 o'clock. At 10 o'clock I read the log and passed it onto the fore bridge. At 20 minutes to 12 I was pacing up and down the deck and I felt a good jar. I thought that was peculiar. I looked along the side and I saw what I thought was a windjammer, but as it came astern I saw it was an iceberg. The engine was going full speed astern then, so I pulled the lug in. After that it got a bit quiet, except for the blowing off of steam, and heard nothing or see nothing till I saw a lifeboat being lowered on the starboard side. I reported it to the bridge. I asked them if they knew there was a boat being lowered. They said they did, and wanted to know who I was. I said I was the after quartermaster. They asked me if I knew where the distress rockets were. I said yes. They said bring them on the bridge. When Captain Smith saw me bring them up, he told me to fire one, and fire one every 5 or 6 minutes. After about 2 or 3 minutes, he said to me, can you Morse? I said yes, a bit. He said, call that light up, tell her where the Titanic's sinking, please get all your boats ready. She never answered.
And that's your strange story, Quartermaster?
Yes.
Just like that?
Just like that.
Now, what about a third-class passenger, Mr. Cohen? I think, Mr. Cohen, you'd had a bit of a celebration with the boys that night.
Yes, I did. We had a celebration with a glass of lemonade.
Am I supposed to believe that?
Yes, you was. So my pals do.
Did you get yourself a life belt early on in the proceedings?
No, not at the time. The reason was because we thought the Titanic was unsinkable.
When did you really believe at last that she was going down?
When the boat was listing. And then I decided to find a lifeboat. I found it very quickly, and then I went towards the lifeboats. I never had a chance to get in any one of them because the order was women and children first. So as I was 11, 19, I was out of it. So I decided to find my own salvation. I went across to the Devitt, climbed across the Devitt, which was a dangerous thing entirely, and went down the rope about 80 feet long and went into the water, into the sea rather.
It sounds easy now, quick, doesn't it, when you tell it?
Yes, it does,
I
but...
bet you wouldn't like to do it now.
No, well, not with this.
I don't know whether they can see you lower down. I don't think they can, but they can imagine it.
Yes.
It's not as bad as they may think.
Yes.
Now, was that lifeboat that picked you up eventually, was it full?
No, it was about 25 people in it. The reason it was fairly empty as it was, because the people on a boat never realised that the boat would sink, and not many people took the opportunity of going into the lifeboats.
A greater risk leaving the ship than staying
That's
aboard.
right, yes.
Let's ask Miss Russell to take up her story again, and let's jump ahead in time. The last we heard from you, Miss Russell, you were going to bed. You decided to go to bed. Now, let's go forward to the time when you were on deck and you asked Wareham, your steward, to go and find your little pig, your mascot. Would you take it from
I
there?
was on A deck in the lounge when Wareham came along, and I said to him, "Here, Wareham, are my trunk keys. Would you mind taking care of my trunks if I don't get back in time in the morning?" So he said, "You better go in and kiss those trunks goodbye." I said, "You don't think there's any danger, do you? If there is, why, you better go back and get my mascot." My mascot was a little pig, a music box. It had been given to me by my mother after a motor accident fatal to everybody but me in France. So he brought the little pig back. It played the matchich. After that, I was in the direct line of light with Bruce Ismay, who saw me and picked me up like a puppy and threw me down the steps. But I was wearing a sheath dress, very narrow skirt, a long fur coat, a woolen cap, some furs, evening slippers, and one thing another, thin stockings, and I went forward to the rail, looked at that very, very high rail with the lifeboat swinging way out on its davits, and I knew I never could make it, not in that skirt. So as I stood there hesitating, a sailor grabbed this little pig from under my arm and said, "Well, if you don't want to be saved, we'll save your child," and he threw the pig into the lifeboat. Well, I stood there hesitating, and as I said to a gentleman alongside, "Should I leave?" He said, "Definitely, madam." Well, I said, "Can't make it." So now, if you will just sit on my hand, this sailor and I will make a little cradle of our hands. You sit down, put your hand around my neck, and we'll toss you right into the lifeboat. And they did. First thing I did then was to hunt for the little pig. I found it, the bottom of the boat with its legs broken, but it still could play the matchich, and I played it all night long to keep the children from crying.
Thank you, Miss Russell. Well, meantime, the entire crew and all the officers of the Titanic were working frantically. And in the wireless room, the chief radio officer, Jack Phillips, was trying to contact nearby ships. The nearest was the Californian, but her solitary operator had gone to bed. The officer of the watch reported the Titanic's rockets and the disappearance of her lights to the captain, but no action was taken. Meantime, Phillips from the Titanic was sending out the old CQD call, the standard distress signal of those times. But then he changed to SOS the first time it had ever been used at sea. And one of the ships to pick that up was the Carpathia, the captain, Captain Rostron. Now, Harold Cottam, there he is, was the operator of the Carpathia, and he received the signal. And here he is, sending his answer now. Now, this equipment you're using now, Mr. Cottam, I understand is the same as in the Titanic, except for the buzzer that Marconi Marine supplied for the Titanic.
Yes.
Is that not right?
Yes.
We've got the coil there,
Yes.
the tuning here,
Yes.
and the receiving.
Yes.
And there was the transmission, was it not?
Yes.
With the spark flying from
Yes.
the points when you press the buzzer.
Yes.
And here the charging and distributing apparatus.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Cottam, the Titanic called you in distress. What was your reaction?
Well, she didn't call me. I called her. About 1 o'clock in the morning, after I'd taken the press, or listened to the press, I took a batch of message for her, and with the intention of redirecting them on to her, I called her up. And the only reply I got that she'd struck ice. And I said, "Was it serious?" And she said, "Yes, this is a CQD, old man. Here's the position, report it, and get here as soon as you can." So I took the position and on a scrap of paper and rushed up to the bridge with it. When I got on the bridge, I contacted the officer of the watch, and the information didn't seem as though it had sunk as fast as I thought it ought to, so I rushed down the ladder and knocked on the captain's cabin, and as I saw a light, I rushed in. And he said, who the hell, or words to that effect. So I said, well, the Titanic struck ice, sir, and she's in distress. I've got the position here. So he said, well, give it me, and he put a dressing gown on and went. So he said, will you confirm this? Go aft and confirm it if you can.
Which you did?
Yes, which I did.
And when you came back, what did he do?
When I came back, he said, well, you'd better go back and tell her that we're going to double bank all the watches on deck and below, and tell him we're
on our way.
On our way.
As fast as you could go.
Yes, as fast as you could go.
Fine, thank you, Mr. Cotton.
Yeah.
Well, the Carpathia was on its way, and back on the Titanic, the last lifeboat got away round about 1:20 in the morning, and it had over 60 people on board.
Commander Lightholer was second officer, and when he had seen the last of the insufficient lifeboats pull away from the ship, he plunged into the sea and was ultimately rescued. All the other officers who went down with the ship were drowned. Commander Lightholer.
Altogether, I have had 4 shipwrecks and a fire during my 30-odd years at sea. But by far and away the worst of them all was the one I'm going to tell you about now, the loss of the Titanic. I joined her in Belfast while she was still in the builder's hands, the biggest and finest ship in the world, and given the normal life of a ship, I'm pretty sure she would have proved the fastest. But let me say right here and now, neither that night nor that voyage were we out for any records. We ran our trials in Belfast Lough, and then took her round to Southampton. On April the 10th, that's 1912, she sailed on her maiden and only voyage for New York. From the moment we left Belfast, we had marvelous weather. And even when we got out on the Western Ocean, or Atlantic, as you probably know it, it was as smooth as the proverbial mill pond, not a breath of wind, and the sea like a sheet of glass. In any other circumstances, those conditions would have been ideal. But anyone with experience of ice at sea knows that those very conditions, and a moonless night, only render the detection of icebergs all the more difficult, and calls for additional alertness on the part of both officers and men. Speaking for myself, I knew only too well that there were chances, if long ones, of sighting an iceberg, but as I reckon, in ample time to clear it with a turn of the wheel. On that night of April the 14th, we all, that is, the captain and officers, knew perfectly well that we were just about entering the region where ice might be sighted at that particular time of the year, and had taken all necessary precautions. Now, throughout the day, there had been the usual wireless messages from different ships reporting the weather, odd icebergs, and so forth. But as none of these bergs reported lay on our course, well, they didn't directly concern us. But when the evidence came to be sifted out at the inquiry held in London afterwards, it then came out that one very vital message received in the Titanic's wireless room that night had never been delivered to the bridge. That message came from a ship called the Masaba, warning all ships of heavy pack ice, icebergs, and field ice in an area then lying right ahead of the Titanic, and what was still worse, not far away. Those immense quantities of ice were abnormal for almost any time of the year, and the significance we should have attached to that report can hardly be exaggerated. In my opinion, It was a warning of the most vital importance. You see, I was officer of the watch and in charge of the ship when that Masaba message came over. And I know perfectly well what I should have done if it had come to my hands. Without a shadow of doubt, I should have slowed her down at once. That would have been imperative, and sent for the captain. More than likely, in fact almost certainly, he would have stopped the ship altogether and waited for daylight to feel his way through. Anyhow, the long and short of it is, neither he nor I nor any other officer of the ship got that message. Now to go on. We were steaming that night at a good 22 knots. At 10 o'clock, I was relieved as officer of the watch by Murdoch, W.M. Murdoch. He and I had been shipmates in many of the ocean greyhounds. And both of us had crossed this ice region times without number, both in clear weather and what's more in fog. After the usual formalities, I handed over, wished him joy of a few perishing cold hours, and went below. I expect his watch went on as mine had done. Nothing to see and nothing to hear, except the distant roar of the water at her bows, that and the half-hourly bells with a lookout must cry of all's well. Of course, he knew nothing of the death trap lying ahead of us, any more than I did. And so, 5 bells, 6 bells, and 7 bells went by. But barely 10 minutes had passed after the sound of the last bell, when there were 3 sharp clangs on the crow's nest bell, followed by a cry from the lookout cage, "Ice right ahead, sir." Murdoch evidently saw the mass of ice practically at the same time as the lookout men, and shouted, "Hard a starboard, full speed astern." His idea was to swing her bow clear, and then put the helm hard over the other way, and so swing her stern clear. And given half a chance, I believe he'd have done it. But going at that speed, it was too late. As it was, her bow swung a bit, but not enough, and she struck. She took the blow along her starboard side, masses of ice actually falling on the foredeck. But what was worse, though we didn't know that till it came out of the inquiry, she was pierced below the waterline in no less than 6 compartments, and from that moment, nothing could have saved her. I was lying in my bunk when I felt the slight jar, not any sense of collision, but more a kind of shiver that ran through the ship. Anyway, it was enough to bring me out of my bunk in one jump. Out on deck, I ran over one side and then to the other, but there wasn't a trace of anything we'd struck. So back I went to my bunk and just waited. If I was wanted, naturally my cabin would be the first place where anyone sent for me would look. You see, apart from being nearly frozen, even an officer, when off watch, isn't exactly welcomed on the bridge, either in pajamas or anything else. Anyway, it wasn't long before Boxall, the 4th officer, poked his head round my door and said, "You know we've struck an iceberg." "I know you've struck something," I told him, not thinking it anything serious and feeling none too pleased. Then he said, "The water's up to F deck in the mailroom." There was no need for him to say anything more. I was into a pair of pants, sweater, and bridge coat and out on deck almost as soon as he was. Now we've been running under a big head of steam, and the sudden stopping of the engines lifted every safety valve. And as a result, the steam roared off at all exhausts. The row was absolutely deafening. Added to that, the engineers started to blow the boilers down. Shout as loud as you like, no one could hear a word. At the same time that Boxall had called me, the order had been given, all hands on deck. And I met my watch tumbling up on the boat deck just as I got there. And the boat deck, just in case you don't know, is the top deck of all. I got hold of the bosun's mate and sort of showed him with my hands that I wanted him to start the men stripping off the boat covers. Now, in the merchant service, men are taught to think and, if necessary, act for themselves. They don't wait for pipes or bugles, and I can tell you, the 700-odd survivors of that night can thank God they don't. Every man jack just went about his job well as if it were an everyday occurrence. When the boats were stripped and cleared, they were swung out and lowered to the level of the boat deck. Just a little while before they were ready to swing out, I happened to meet the captain, and I asked him, by cupping my hands over his ear and yelling at the top of my voice, "Shall I get the women and children away, sir?" He just nodded, so I started to fill the first boat. Just about now, thank goodness, the roar of escaping steam stopped, and passengers, now they could hear themselves think, started asking me, "Why are you getting the boats out? And why are you putting women and children in them?" I told them it was merely a precaution, and that very likely they'd all be taken on board again at daylight, or at the worst, taken on board the ship everyone could clearly see, only a few miles away. We could see all her lights quite plainly. But here again we were up against it. That ship was the Californian, and though her lights were plain to everyone on board the Titanic, she seemed to pay not the slightest heed either to our wireless calls or to the distress signals we were firing every minute. The reason why she didn't answer our wireless calls, which other ships heard halfway around the earth, was because she only carried one wireless operator. And when we struck the iceberg, he'd just gone off watch, so it was no fault of his. But why no notice was taken of our distress signals, shells that are fired hundreds of feet up into the air, to explode with a cascade of stars, heaven only knows. What a chance her captain missed. He could have laid his ship right alongside the Titanic and taken practically every soul on board. However, he didn't, and the two ships gradually drifted further and further apart. And, according to the officer of the watch of the Californian, the Titanic's lights disappeared at 2:40 a.m. They did. And with his own eyes, he'd personally witnessed one of the greatest tragedies of the sea. But to go back again, up to the time of getting away the first few boats, no one believed that the ship was actually in any danger. I'm afraid my own confidence that she wouldn't or couldn't sink rather conveyed itself to others, for there were actually cases where women absolutely refused to be put in a boat. I remember one young couple, evidently not long married, walking up and down the boat deck. I asked the girl, she was only a girl, from the western states I should say, if I should put her in a boat. But no, she wouldn't be parted from her husband. Not on your life, she said. We've started together, and we'll finish together. Brave girl, but she didn't know how near that finish was. Certainly I didn't. As time went on, I could see the bows of the ship getting steadily lower and lower in the water. Now, between lowering one boat and another, I frequently took a run forward and a quick look down a long stairway that led from the boat deck 3 or 4 decks down. Frankly, I'm never likely to forget the sight of that cold greenish water creeping step by step up that stairway. Some of the lights were shining down on the water, and others, already submerged, were giving it a sort of ghastly transparency. But for my purpose, I could tell by that staircase measurement exactly what was happening, how far down she'd gone, and how quickly she was going. Just when I first realized how desperately serious things were, I don't know. But I do know that before many boats were away, I got to piling more and more people into them. Partly because I now knew she was going, and partly because the boats were not remaining by the ship to be filled to their full capacity when waterborne. a far easier job than lowering him with their full complement from that tremendous height. Another thing, it was plain to me that if we were going to avoid the unutterable disgrace of going down with boats to hang in at the davits, we'd got not only to take chances, but we got to work like blazes. I've always admired the coolness and efficiency of merchant sailors in the Titanic Honor, and I've seen a few. But that night, well, the Titanic's men set up a standard that'll never be beaten. Every single boat was filled and lowered from davit head to water and got away without an accident of any kind. And that despite the pitch-black night and the conditions we were working under. The same tribute must be paid to the passengers for the courage they showed. For by the time little more than half the boats had gone, I knew, and I'm pretty certain they knew, that she was definitely going down. You've got to remember, the Californian had drifted away. There weren't enough boats to take half the people, and the chances of the other half in that icy cold water were absolutely nil. Yet, there was never the slightest attempt to get into a boat out of turn. In fact, with the last couple of boats, it was even difficult to find women to fill them, though of course there were still a good many on board. Then came the very last boat of all, and it was a sort of raft with collapsible canvas sides, stowed upside down on top of the officers' quarters, and that's above the boat deck. A seaman named Hemming, he'd been with me in many of the mail boats, he and I cut this one adrift and threw it down on the water, which was now about 2 feet above the boat deck. Hemming, by the way, had earlier on given up his place in the boat after being told off to take charge of it, and unbeknown to me, had followed round, helping me with the lowering. Ticklish job even in daylight. Having dumped this collapsible, there was not a thing further we could do on that side, so both of us went over to the starboard side. But we found all the boats were away from there too. Of course, there were still hundreds of people round. As Hemming and I looked down from the top of the officers' quarters, where we were standing, the ship took a sudden dip, and a sea came rolling up, carrying everyone with it. Many were drowned there and then. Everyone that could just instinctively started to scramble up towards the after end of the ship. But that was only putting it off. In fact, it was lessening their chances. The plunge had to come, and that I could see was pretty soon. And no one's chances were going to be improved by getting mixed up in a struggling mass. Hemming, as I found out afterwards, headed for one of the after boat falls, slid down, dropped into the water, swam away, and was eventually saved. For my part, I turned forward and took a header from the top of the wheelhouse. I started to swim away, but got sucked down 2 or 3 times. In fact, I got mighty near the edge of things before I finally came up alongside the collapsible. We'd hove into the water from the top of the officers' quarters, and there I hung on. A bit later, the forward funnel guys carried away, and the funnel, weighing perhaps 50 or 60 tons, fell down with a crash on the water. It missed the raft and some of us hanging onto it, by inches. But there were a good many it didn't miss. Next thing I remember, I was still hanging on to a bit of rope attached to the raft, but some 30 or 40 yards away from the ship. The wash of the falling funnel had evidently picked us up, raft and all, and flung us clear of the ship altogether. Several of us scrambled up onto the slippery bottom of the raft, and it was from there I saw the Titanic sink. As I watched, I could see her bow getting deeper and deeper in the water, with the foremast sticking up above the surface, whilst her stern lifted higher and higher, till it was right out of the water. When she got to an angle of about 60 degrees, there was a sullen sort of rumbling roar, as her massive boilers all left their beds and went crashing down through the bulk's heads and everything that stood in their way. Up to that moment, she had stood out as clear with her rows of electric lights all burning. When the boilers broke away, she was, of course, plunged into absolute darkness, though her huge black outline was still perfectly distinct up against the stars and sky. Slowly, she reared up on end, till at last she was absolutely perpendicular. Then, quite quietly, but quicker and quicker, she seemed just to slide away under the surface and disappear. As she vanished, everyone round me on the upturned boat, as though they could hardly believe it, just said, "She's gone." Some little time later, I found that the senior wireless operator was standing just behind me, and from the wireless messages he told me he'd received from different ships, I figured up in my mind that the Cunard liner Carpathia, one that he said was coming to our rescue, should be up about daylight. It was then I first heard of the Masaba message, and when I said I didn't remember it, he told me he'd put it under a paperweight at his elbow and never sent it to the bridge. Many died from cold during the night, the wireless operator amongst them, and a mighty long time it seemed before daylight broke, standing wet through and up to our knees in icy water on that upturned boat. Frankly, I don't think many of us expected to see daylight. At one time during the night, someone suggested we should say Our Father, and I don't think it was exactly scare that made everyone join in. But you'd need to be in somewhat the same fix, where a couple of minutes may mean all the difference between, well, here and hereafter, to understand the feeling we put into it. I've heard that prayer ever since I was the height of 6 penitent coppers, but never with such intense earnestness as the surroundings lent to it that night. However, when daylight did break, most of us were still heads up, and we of the upturned boat transferred to one of the lifeboats. At full daylight, there was the Carpathia steaming toward us. I needn't say just what sort of a welcome sight it was either. Cruising slowly round, she collected the boats one by one. Mine, I know, was loaded down to the gunwales, and no easy job to keep afloat in the rising sea. At last, everyone was safely on board, and with the 700-odd survivors of that night, she turned away from that tragic spot and headed for New York.
Well, my father was a builder, a master builder, and in England in 1911 business wasn't very good, and he had built a lot of houses which he couldn't let. Now that must sound very odd today, but it was so in those days. And when a friend of his who'd gone to Canada sometime earlier on came home to see him, he said, "You know, why are you putting up with this recession here? Why don't you join me in Canada? Together we could make a real do of things." And then within the space of one evening, my father decided to cut all his losses and go to Canada to join his friend. Well, in those days, one went to New York by fast electric liners, one of which went every day of the week, I understand, and then on to Canada by train, because at that time of the year, when the St. Lawrence is frozen, one would have to go to St. John's or Halifax, which were small ports, And then a very tiresome journey across Canada from there. So we were going to New York. And my father made this decision this evening. I knew nothing about it, of course, I was in bed. But my mother was absolutely horror-stricken. Well, to really make the point there, I must tell you that my mother was quite a remarkable woman. She had married when she was quite young, and she was 18, and she'd married a very bad marriage, and her parents weren't at all pleased with her. But they were right, and she was wrong. And by the time she was 31, she had had 9 children, 9 babies, and they had all died. She had known what it was to be desperately unhappy and poor. And her children died and left her absolutely bereft, and with all this trouble behind her, which I'm quite sure made for the wonderful character she had. She had no illusions about things. Her feet were firmly on the ground. And so she met my father, married him, and they were divinely happy. He was so good to her. And I was born, which added to her joy. She had a lovely home. My father had a motor car, which in those days was rather remarkable. And everything was wonderful until this night. And the moment this arrangement had been made to go to Canada, my mother had this dreadful premonition. She'd never had one before, and she never had one after. But she said, no, we can't do this. It's quite wrong. Something dreadful will happen. And I tell you what, the sort of woman she was. She'd got both feet on the ground, and for her to behave like that was absolutely unbelievable to everyone. But she just had that premonition. And my father said, oh, nonsense. And of course, the time went by, and the house was sold, and we were ready to go, and we went down to the ship. And she said to him, now, I don't want any more unhappiness about this, but my mind is made up, and I will not go to bed in this ship. I shall sleep in the daytime, and I shall sit up at night. And I so well remember what he said to her. He said, if you want to be so stupid, I can't stop you. She said, I know, but I'm going to do it. And she did. And she sat up Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night, and on Saturday night, she heard an odd sound, and she awakened my father and made him go up on the deck. And he came back and told her that it was ice floes that she could hear grinding against the side of the ship, and not to be so silly. And at breakfast the next morning, other people said they had gone up on deck. They had heard this sort of noise, and they agreed it was ice floes. And my mother then said, well, surely if there's ice in abundance in the sea, there could be icebergs. And this officer who was our table, he said, oh, nonsense, this is an iceberg. It's an enormous thing. We should see an iceberg. You've nothing to be afraid of. And that was on the Sunday morning. And for the first time, since we had gone on board the ship, she didn't get up from breakfast and go straight to bed, which was what she normally did, because it was Sunday and she thought she'd like to go to church, which she did. And then we had lunch together before she went to bed. And I remember that meal so well because that was the last meal that the three of us ever had together. Because in the evening, by dinner time, I was in bed, of course. And she just came and joined in whatever was happening during the evening, that sort of thing. And my father got very cross because he had every reason to dislike gambling. His father had been a compulsive gambler and had died utterly penniless from being quite a wealthy man. And so everybody was gambling on this Sunday night. They were making books, I think, the service, and having sweepstakes as to what time she would get in so many minutes past so and so. My father would have nothing to do with it. And so he went to bed quite early, for him anyway. And my mother sat down to sew and read, and she looked up at him. He was reading. He said he'd got a very interesting book. But quite quickly he went to sleep, and she got up and took the book from him and settled down again. And she said at 10 minutes to 12, she felt a slight bump. And she said it was just like a train pulling into a station. It just jerked. It was very slight, but she said she knew that it was this dreadful something, and she wakened my father. She wakened me, and my father said no, he wasn't going up on deck again after the night before. But she literally pulled him out of bed and made him go up. And she then said she was going to dress me, and I, being sleepy and very naughty, said I wasn't going to be dressed. Nothing to be dressed for. I came back to bed. My father came back very quickly because he could get up to the boat deck in the lift very quickly from where our cabin was. And he came back and he picked me up and wrapped his blanket tightly around me as if I were a baby. And my mother said nothing to him, and I used to say to her sometimes, years afterwards, I can't understand why you didn't say to him, what was it? Which she certainly did not say. And she said, I didn't have to say, what was it? I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was this dreadful something that I had to live with for months, and there was nothing more I could say. So he put his very thick coat on her and put another one on himself, and without any words at all, we went out of the cabin and into the lift and up onto the boat deck. Now, if we hadn't done that at that time, I very much doubt I'd be talking to you today, because, as you know, there was accommodation for less than 800 people in the lifeboats, and she was carrying 2,200. So it was a question as who was there in time to get into one of the all too few lifeboats. Well, they weren't launched very quickly, because at first no one thought anything was going to happen. But my father went away and spoke to an officer, and he said, they are going to launch lifeboats, but you'll all be back on board for breakfast. And so they launched these boats, and my father helped. He knew a lot about the sea. And he put me in the lifeboat and told me to be good, said to me, hold Mummy's hand, and I thought he was coming after me, but he didn't. Then it dawned on me, of course, that he wasn't coming, that I wouldn't see him anymore. And that collision was 10 minutes to 12, and the Titanic sank at 2:20. So if we had had enough lifeboats, no one would have died that night at all. And it would have been a 9 days wonder that the ship sank on its maiden voyage. It didn't matter, nobody died, that would have been that. And here we are all these years after, with the whole world still interested in the Titanic. And we rowed away from the ship as fast as we could, because one has to do that, because I believe the suction when a vessel goes down is absolutely enormous. And we rowed away, and I didn't close my eyes at all. I saw that ship sink, and I saw that ship break in half. And for so many years people have argued with me about that. But now at last it has been proven beyond all doubt that she did break in half. I know she did, I saw her. And the forepart went down nose first, and the stern of that ship stood up in the water for quite a long time, or it seemed a long time to me, and then keeled over. And we heard the dreadful sound of people drowning, which was, unbelievable. And then, because our lifeboat was so full, so overfull, the officers called all the boats together and transshipped some of us, 1 in that boat and 2 in that and 3 in that, and I got separated from my mother. And that was the most terrifying thing to happen to a child. And we were picked up, as you know, in the morning by this little ship, the Carpathia. And the rescue of people from lifeboats in mid-ocean is quite a terrifying thing. These little boats, shall we say, draw up alongside, for want of a better expression, to what looks like an enormous vessel. She was quite a small vessel, the Carpathia, but she looked big from there. And then how do you get on board? You don't have a gangplank like you do when you're ashore. And so they opened a sort of, I don't know whether the word is right, a hatch in the side of the ship where the luggage used to be laid. And they threw down rope ladders, and people like my mother and other grown-ups had to climb up in mid-ocean up a swaying rope ladder, which she said was the most terrifying thing. A sailor behind sort of holding on. And then what can the children do? We couldn't climb up a rope ladder. So they got these big luggage nets, and the mesh is very wide apart. It's quite a big mesh. Children would have slipped through it, small children. Anyway, our legs and feet would have gone through. So each child was put in a sack. And I remember being petrified when I was put in that sack, and it was tied around, and the sack full of these children were put into these huge nets, and quite safely, of course, hauled aboard. But that really was quite terrifying. Then having got on board, of course, I couldn't find my mother. And I didn't find her for hours, but eventually I found her. And I'm quite sure one of the most pathetic things must have been the whole of the next day, how these poor women, such as my mother, roamed about the ship looking to see if they could see the husband they left behind. But no one found anyone. And we just went to New York in this little ship, and then my mother's first words were when she landed, "How soon can I go home?" We came straight back here. And as I say, all these years later, this interest is profound. And it's because there was no need for anyone to die. No one should have died. Had she had enough lifeboats with 2.5 hours and a very smooth sea, nobody would have died. And one life is worth more than the whole ship, surely. That is what I saw, that is what I remember. And there are hardly any of us now to share this memory, of course. I'm the only living survivor now that can remember it and get about, so to speak. There's a very good friend of mine, she's much older than me, but she's ill and she's had a stroke and she's deaf. And the other two in England, beside that lady, are too young to remember it. They were under 5. And in America, as far as I know, and I think I got this right, there are no survivors who can remember it. There's an old lady over 100, and she doesn't remember it. So, bless her heart, you have to count her out. Apart from that, I don't think there's anyone that can really tell the whole story of it, except myself. We were booked in a ship called the Philadelphia. And this cold strike came and she didn't sail. And we were then offered a berth in the Titanic, which absolutely delighted my father. I thought it was wonderful. The whole world was talking about that ship. We had to pay extra money to travel in them. Well, when I boarded her at Southampton, well, you can't see very much of a ship you're boarding. You can just see the bit of the gangway you go up, so that wasn't very much. She seemed very, very large. Indeed she was, but particularly to a child who hadn't been to ship before. I saw a little dog that was travelling without its master in care of the crew, a dear little dog, which I was allowed. My father managed to get round one of the sailors to let us go aft where this little dog was. There were a lot of dogs on board, and I loved that little dog dearly. And it was drowned, poor little thing. And I was very touched from the first time I opened the first page of Walter Lord's Book A Night to Remember. He mentions that little dog. And I always wanted one like that, but I didn't get one for many years, but I did eventually. And I remember a lot about playing on the deck with that little dog. I remember the dining saloon very well, which was very nice. I remember the playroom, I suppose it was a playroom, where I played quite a lot with other children. And the decks where my father walked with me, of course, the second-class decks. But it isn't blurred at all, but it's all shadowed by what happened eventually. There wasn't any panic until the lifeboats left, and then there was panic galore. We were down on the ocean, we could hear them running about on the decks and screaming. You can imagine people came out from their cabin, went onto the deck, no lifeboat, tearing around the other side. That's when the panic was there. There wasn't any panic at the time I got in a lifeboat because there weren't enough people up there. And there were enough people there to just get into the lifeboats. But after that, when the others started coming up from their cabins and there were no boats, gosh, there was panic, we could hear it. Definitely. But the most dreadful sound of all is the sound of people drowning. The screams. Absolutely ghastly. My mother used to say sometimes, she couldn't get me to talk about it for years, but if ever anyone did talk to me, I said that, she used to say yes. But do you remember the silence that followed it? And that's quite right, it says the whole world stood still that night. Once the lights had gone, the ship had gone, the sound had gone. Oh, it was dreadful. Dreadful. Oh, that I can't possibly describe. I can only tell you that I'm a terrible coward, and I never look at pictures of it again now, ever. when I get various books and things, I turn that page over very quickly. In fact, if you look through some of my Titanic books, you'll probably find a piece of paper slotted in that page, but I can't bear to look at it. It was I suppose it was as a microcosm, is that the word? Looking at it from low down on the sea, it was dreadful, dreadful. I don't like looking at pictures of ships at all. I don't like pictures of the Titanic particularly because I can see it happening, you know. Well, there's no question about the fact that they played, and there's no question about the fact that after we were down on the water and they were playing, they played one version of the hymn, Nearer My God to Thee, of which there are three. I've had this out so many times. And the one they played was the one that was played in church some months after, when I was with my grandmother, and I was so frightened I came out of church, I ran out. I knew the tune so well. But they won't have it, the Americans won't have it. People say, no, no, it's not it, but it was just ragtime, but it wasn't. It wasn't. But we were down on the ocean by then. They were playing when we left the deck, of course they were. They'd been playing all the evening, I suppose. There are still threats of legal things even these days about whether the ship that was so close to us was the Californian or not. I mean, I saw that ship. It's terribly close. Now, the sort of thing that I must emphasize is people say this, say that, say the other, and they're now asking me, was that the Californian you saw? I cannot possibly tell you. I've always been told, with Board of Trade inquiries and everything that went, that that was the Californian. But I, Eva Hart, can't make that statement, but I don't know. I mean, short of going up to the ship and looking at the name on it, you wouldn't know. I can't think that the two big inquiries, one in America and one here, which were held at the time, would have been wrong about that. But they're trying to say now, of course, that it was so, as you know. But I refuse to say that it was, because I don't know. And the other thing I'm saying is that I didn't see a ship 19 miles away. I saw a ship that was so close, and they said at the time it was less than 9 miles away. Now they're trying to say it was 19. I saw it, you know, it wasn't just lights on the horizon, you could see it was a ship. And I saw our rockets being fired, which that ship must have seen. Well, this inquiry says that they did see it, but they didn't think it was a portent of danger, but I would have thought in the middle of the Atlantic, in the middle of the night, that rockets must mean trouble. Not only my opinion. But undoubtedly in the next few months this will come up again. I've been interviewed and talked to about it, and I still say I don't know. I can only tell you it was a ship. My father's sister lived in New York, and the plan was that we were going to stay with her for, I think it was 3 or 4 days, and then get the train through to Canada. So of course she met us, and we were whisked straight off to her home. And I was ill. I had, when they threw me from one boat into the other, they bruised me very badly right across, and I had lots of bouts of sickness, so they took me straight away into a hospital to have a look at me. And so I didn't see really much of the furore, naturally. And we came back home quite quickly. Now, coming home, my mother went to bed every night and slept. I was the one that was a terror coming home. I wouldn't come out of the cabin. She lured me up onto the deck one day, and that was about all. I was terrified. Well, she came back to her parents, who of course were getting on. She was 50 by then, my mother. And we lived in this small town with my parents. And then I had a great musical talent, I was told. Anyway, I played the piano very well, and I taught. And at 18 I had my voice trained, and I did a lot of professional singing. And she died when I was 23, and I went off to Australia. Well, I went to Singapore to stay with her godson, who invited me to do that, and then I went on to Australia with the idea that I might live there. I wasn't sure. But I did a lot of singing, and even in those days I was singing on the radio in Australia, and that's a long time ago, 1929. And but I didn't like it well enough to want to live there, so I came back to England. And I came back to England, and I had 3 or 4 really bad colds, really bad colds, and I couldn't sing. And I lost a lot of engagements through not being able to go, and I thought, well, perhaps, I came back in the winter, you see, from this very warm climate. So I thought, well, perhaps I better do something else. So a friend of mine had a very large wholesale motor business, and so I joined him there and ran the wholesale department. Still did a lot of singing in the evenings and that sort of thing. And then, of course, when the war broke out, like everyone else, it wasn't a question of what I wanted to do. I was a single woman on my own, and I could very easily have been sent up to a munition factory in goodness knows where. So I went to the Ministry of Food, and I was the food officer for this borough, and I hated it. Didn't dislike it. Filling in forms and answering questions, no good to me. So I got out of that and went to work in a factory where they were making not actually munitions but parts for guns and for what we called bomb slips, the things that the bombs were slipped with, I suppose, out of the aeroplane. And I liked that. It was people, working with people. And the director let me join the Industrial Welfare Society and paid for my training. So I became an industrial welfare officer, and that I did to the end of my working days, which I loved because it was dealing with people. In addition to that, I was a magistrate, and I loved that too, because again, it's people. Now I'm so old I have to just sit and talk about it.
I went on watch at 8 o'clock on that Sunday night, the 14th of April, along with Moody, who was the 6th officer, and we went on the bridge with Mr. Murdoch, the 1st officer. It was a clear night. There was no signs of any fog. A set of stars was handed over to me that Lightholer had taken in the 2nd dog watch. When I got these stars, I said, now Moody, you go around the decks and come back at 9 o'clock. I don't know whether the captain came up before 9 o'clock or after 9 o'clock, but anyway, I didn't leave the bridge until after 10 o'clock. Having worked the stars out, and when the captain came up, I showed him the position on the chart. She was just over 20 miles ahead of the dead reckoning. And at 10 o'clock, I told Moody to take over the bridge, and I reported to the 1st officer that I was going around the decks. It was a customary thing. At the time when the iceberg was reported from the crow's nest, when they struck the bells, I was sitting in my cabin having a cup of tea, and immediately got up and walked along to the bridge, about 60 feet away on the same deck. I was about halfway between the officers' quarters, the entrance to the officers' quarters and the bridge, when the crash came, and it didn't break my step. She was doing full speed, and it didn't break my step. And I got to the bridge, and the captain had evidently arrived about the same moment, and I heard him say to Murdoch, what's the matter, what have you struck? He said, we've struck an iceberg, sir. He said, I'm going full speed astern, sir, on the port engine. He swung her head round towards port, and she was on the swing, and that's why she was torn underneath. She was penetrated in 6 compartments. Well, whilst the captain was talking to Murdoch at the starboard wing of the bridge, I slipped down to go forward and have a look to see if I could find any damage. Nobody told me to go. You had to go down about 4 bridge ladders, you see. And I went forward to the entrance to the 3rd class These third-class passengers, Southern European people, were streaming up on deck, and I went down below. I think it was 2 decks down, as low as I could go without removing any hatches or anything. I went down to the third class, crossed over to the starboard side, and I walked along there and looked in the cross passages. I couldn't hear any noise. I couldn't see any damage. And I eventually came up on deck again. As I was emerging on the deck, some of these men were on their way back again to their beds. And there was one man had a piece of ice, and I took it away out of his hands, wondering where he got it from. And I spoke to him in English and tried to make him understand that it was nothing, there was nothing the matter. Go down and go to bed and go to sleep again, you see. And I took this piece of ice and walked along the upper deck on the starboard side to see where the ice came from. And there, just inside of the ship's rail, there was a powdering of ice running along as though she'd compressed it. There was no wind, you see, and it would fall inboard. I came up onto the bridge again and reported to the captain, I've been down below, sir, right down as far as I could go without removing hatches or tarpaulins or anything, right through the third-class accommodation forward. And I don't see any signs of any damage, not even a glass port broken. He said, did you see the carpenter anywhere, Mr. Boxall? I said, no, sir, I didn't. He said, I do wish you would go down and find him and tell him to sound the ship round for and let me know right away. Well, I didn't get down all the ladders down to the foredeck. I met the carpenter coming up, absolutely out of breath, and he said, Mr. Boxall, he said, the forepeak hatch is blown off and number 1 tarpaulin is ballooning up. He said, she's evidently making water fast. So I said, all right, go along, carpenter. The captain is on the starboard wing of the bridge, and tell the captain. I didn't get down to the foredeck because I met a mail clerk coming up. And he said, Mr. Boxall, the mail room's filling. So I said, oh, carry on, and you'll find the captain on the starboard wing of the bridge and report to him. I said, I'll go down there and have a look. So I continued on my way down to the mail room. I tried to go into the first-class entrance from that lower deck, from the foredeck, but they'd got the watertight door closed. I had to come up all these ladders and go up over the promenade deck and then down through the main saloon entrance, where I found the band was beginning to tune up. And I got my way down to the mail room, and I got down as far as the sorting room. And all the mail clerks were there pulling letters out of the racks. And I was standing on the top of a companionway from the sorting room down to the handing room. And I saw a bag floating by. I instinctively stooped down to try and pick it up. I just couldn't reach it. I realized then that it was serious. So I started to come back again. When I got to the first-class passenger accommodation, I met one of the assistant stewards. And he said, Mr. Boxall, shall I send some men down there? I said, I think you'd better not. I'll go up and report this to the bridge, and we'll send down and let you know. As I came up through the top lounge, where the band was, they were playing Alexander's Ragtime Band. And I got back to the boat deck and saw the captain. And I told him, I said, the mail room's filling, sir. Should I send a distress signal? And the captain said, I've already sent a distress signal. What position did you send it from? He said, from the 8 o'clock DR. Well, I said, that was about 20 miles ahead of that, sir. If you like, I will run the position up from the star position up to the time of the contact with the iceberg. And because I said she was about 20 miles ahead of her position, I amended this position and took it on to the wireless room. And Phillips, the wireless operator, was bending over his instrument, the telephone, holding the telephone. He says, I'm in contact with the Carpathia. Well, I put the amended position down on the desk, and I said, now send that amended position. Do you understand? He said, yes. Well, I said, send that off right away. And that was the position that the Carpathia came to. And I worked on the boat covers, taking off the boat covers on the boat deck, when I heard the crow's nest report a light on the starboard bow. Well, I went on the bridge right away. I found this light with my own glasses, but I wanted the telescope to define what it was, and I realized then that it was two mast headlights of a steamer below the horizon. And the lights were very close, and I went back and told the captain, there's a steamer in sight, very nearly ahead, but slightly on the starboard bow. And if she continues on her course, she'll pass close to us down the port side. Oh, I asked the captain, shall I send up some distress rockets? Then we started sending off these distress rockets, quartermaster and I on the bridge. But I never knew how many I had fired. I knew very well that there was some in the box. The box holds a dozen, and when I told the captain, I said, there are still some in there, sir, but I don't know how many I fired. I didn't see any reply. Some of the passengers that was on the bridge said that they did see a reply. We also called up this ship as she drew closer with a Morse lamp, a very powerful Morse lamp that we had. And eventually this steamer approached and approached until you could see all her lights with a naked eye. And I should say that she must have been within 5 miles off. You could not only see her lights with a naked eye, but you could see the lights in her portholes. So I reckon that she must have been within 5 miles. And then eventually she turned away and showed a stern light. And about that time, the captain came across the bridge and said, Mr. Boxall, you go away in that boat, pointing to the port emergency boat number 2. And he said, hurry up, Mr. Wild's waiting to lower it. So I said, you see that white light over there? So pointing it out to him, he said, yes. I said, that is the stern light of that ship. I tumbled into this boat. They'd started to lower her. I tumbled into this lifeboat and we got lowered down. I found that I only had 3 of the ship's crew, a steward, a cook, and a sailor. She had been lowered very slowly. She wouldn't run until you helped the falls, and eventually became waterborne. I tried to count the passengers, but it was difficult as they didn't speak English, you see. And I reckon that I had between 30, around about 30 on board the boat. And the captain looked over the side from the bridge and sung out and told me to go round to the starboard side, to the gangway doors, which was practically opposite side to where I was lowered. I had great difficulty in getting the boat round there. There was suction. I was using a stroke oar, standing up, and there was a lady helping. She was steering the boat round the ship's stern. When I passed round the boat to try and get to this gangway door on the starboard side, her propellers were out of water. I'm not certain if I didn't pass underneath them. But when I did eventually reach there, I found that there was such a mob standing in the gangway doors. Really, I daren't go alongside, because if they'd jumped, they would have swamped the boat. She was only a small boat, would hold about 35 people. No buoyancy tanks in her at all. Boat that was always turned out, ready for emergency purposes like man overboard. However, I decided that it was not, that I daren't go alongside again, and I pulled off and laid off until I pulled away about a quarter of a mile, I suppose. And I couldn't, what struck me as being strange, that all the other boats, I couldn't see one of them. Long before I left the bridge, a telephone message had come through from the first officer who was aft. He'd been lowering all the starboard boat, and he'd told the quartermaster aft to report to the bridge that all the starboard boats had gone. That's a long time before I left the ship. Well, those boats must have pulled around to the port side, which was really the south side. And I was on the starboard side, on the north side of the ship, all alone. I couldn't see a boat anywhere. That is when I burnt the green light to try and attract the other boats, but I never found them. The sea was perfectly smooth when we left the ship. Every star in the heavens was visible, but there was no moon. So it was dark. And, well, everything was very peaceful. No wind. And no moon. Stars. Smooth water. Until after about an hour, the wind got up and there was a little sea. For a long time, we didn't move the boat. When we laid off on the starboard side, you could see by the arrangements of the lights, all the lights were burning, and you could see that she was going down. You could see that her stern was getting pretty low in the water. She was certainly going down. There was no doubt about it then. And well, we got away clear of the ship. And we just laid on the oars until eventually they realized that she'd gone, and we heard all the screams. We couldn't do anything. And the screams went on for some considerable time. I can't remember the time when she sank, but it was in the early hours. I didn't see any ice whilst I was in the boat, but I could hear there was a little breeze sprang up before we got to the Carpathia, and I could hear the water on the ice, field ice or whatever it was. But I never saw any ice until after we'd been picked up by the Carpathia. Eventually, we saw a rocket go up, and it turned out to be the Carpathia. So she'd seen my green light that I had burnt. So I burnt another one. And eventually, she steered for the position that I was in. And consequently, I was the first boat picked up. People on the Carpathia told me that it was about just before 4 o'clock, about 5 minutes to 4, I think. I got alongside there. Everything was ready. Derricks was hoisted. Derrick falls had bowlines in them, and there was ladders over the side. Absolutely everything had been done that was possible to be done. And the captain kept sending down to know if there was an officer in the boat and send him up at once. But I sent a message back, when I get the boat empty, then I'll come up. I've only got one sailor in the boat. And eventually the boat emptied, and then I went up to the Captain Rostron on the bridge. And he said, where's the ship? I said, she's sunk. And I said, I don't know where the other boats are. I've not seen any of them. But they'll be all to the southward of us somewhere. And it was daylight eventually before any boats were sighted. And it was nearly 8 o'clock, I think. As near as I can remember, it was certainly broad daylight when we picked up the other boats. We cruised around in the Carpathia then. And eventually picked up all the other boats. And some of them were hoisted and left in their davits, and some were turned in and put on the deck. We steamed over the ground in the daylight. The Californian She appeared. I don't remember seeing any other ships. The captain was going to put his officers on watch and watch. So we Titanic officers, the juniors, that was Moody and Pittman and I, we went on watches. We took soundings because we got fog all the way into New York.
What was the first real indication you had that something had gone wrong?
Well, I went to the gala dinner. I had on a white satin evening dress. And after the gala dinner, knowing that we were going to post letters, I thought it a good idea to go up to the drawing room and write a few letters. And as I sat there writing, this was on Sunday night, the rule and regulations of White Star are lights out 11:30, especially on Sunday. So I was writing, and the call was lights out, and I turned to the steward and I handed him my letters and I said, I'll pay you for the lamps tomorrow morning, but take the letters, they're ready. And I walked down quietly down the hallway until I got to my stateroom. And just before going to my stateroom, A11, there was a bump. As I turned the handle of my room, there was another bump. And as I got into my room, there was a third bump. I thought to myself, what are these bumps? Sort of little pushes, nothing very violent. And I had made a date with the gentleman to take a cup of coffee with him that night, and I called out to him at a nearby stateroom and I said, come on, see what the bumps are. And I slipped on a coat over my white satin evening dress and went right out from my own stateroom, because my stateroom had a door leading to the promenade deck. And as I got out on the promenade deck, I saw a large gray, well, it looked to me like a building floating by. Great big gray thing. But that building kept bumping along the rail, and as it bumped, it sliced off bits of ice, and ice fell all over the deck. And I, and a great many of my foolish fellow passengers, we just picked up the ice and started to play snowballs. We thought it was fun. We asked the officers if there was any danger, and said, no, nothing at all, nothing at all. Nothing at all, just a mere nothing. We just hit an iceberg. It's nothing, nothing. I remember looking over the rail and seeing a fully lighted ship very close by. I've always said that I saw a man walking on the deck, and I did. They claim I didn't, but I'm extremely farsighted. As a matter of fact, I had defective eyesight, and I was too farsighted. Now that ship, we were told, was the California. And it was the California. With all the denials that have been made since, it was the California.
How are you so sure of that?
What's that?
How are you so sure of that?
Because it was the only other ship, and when we got on the Carpathia, we were told by Captain Rostron that the Carpathia was standing by And the officers on the Titanic told us all, don't worry. The California will pick up everybody in case you don't come back for breakfast. Now, we were told we were only going to leave because it was rules and regulations. No danger whatsoever. We'd all be back for breakfast. And I thought it was perfectly asinine to leave a warm, comfortable ship to come back for breakfast. Oh, that was why. The English have got rules and regulations, but they're just plumb crazy. I'm sticking to this ship.
And you had no idea, even long after you hit the iceberg, that you were in real danger?
No, I just thought it was ridiculous. So I went to bed. I was in bed, and some man, I never yet identified who he was, came to my door, knocked at the door and said, "Madam, get up. They're claiming that women and children should leave the ship. Put on your life belt. Get up." So I got out of bed. I only had one woolen dress that was out. A sheath dress, a half a yard around the ankles, so tight that from my hips to my ankles I was practically, well, I would say I was in a potato sack. I couldn't walk. I had a hobble. In those days, they were called hobble skirts. And there I was, in this tight skirt, absolutely useless. And I put on a wool cap and a couple of foxes. I remember a white fox and a brown fox or something. And the thinnest fur coat I had, a broadtail, which I might as well have put a tissue paper on. I couldn't have been dressed more ridiculously. And lovely velvet slippers with diamond buckles. Now, I had promised my mother never to leave my little mascot. I thought nothing of danger, and the little mascot was left on my dressing table. But I did do something that was clearly idiotic. I locked the windows of all of my staterooms. I locked every trunk. I locked the bureau drawers and the cupboards. I took all the keys, the trunk keys, and then went forward on the same deck to the drawing room, A deck, and sat down comfortably in a big easy chair. And as I sat there, Wareham, my steward, came along, and I said, "Wareham, here's my trunk keys and my stateroom keys. I want my keys. I understand we're being taken off the ship, and maybe you're going to be towed to Newfoundland, and maybe I won't come back in time. So here's my trunk keys. When you get to Newfoundland, go to the customs and send my trunks down to New York, will you?" He said, "You go on in, kiss your trunks goodbye." I said, "You think there's danger?" "Well," he said, "I've got 5 children at home. I'm a bit worried." I believe I'd kiss my trunks goodbye. Oh, I said, "For goodness sakes, go back and get my pig. It's on the dressing table." And I handed him the key to my stateroom, and he came back with the pig. And my fellow passengers looked at me in utter disgust. I noticed a great many passengers forming a queue, taking their jewelry and their money from the safe. Well, I thought everything would be safer in the safe, so I left all my jewelry and I left all my money in the safe. And this little pig was never a money bag. It's been associated over the years on television shows and films that I had enough cupidity to save my money bank. I never saved a penny, not a nickel. And it took me 3.5 years of acute starvation to pay back my debts. So I had my little pig, and I felt safe. Now, why did I have the little pig? How did I come to have it?
You tell me.
Well, in 1911, I was going to the races in Deauville, again, to cover the races. And I drove to Deauville, down that dreadful, what they call the Hill of Death, before you get to Deauville. The young man who was driving the car took the wheel, didn't permit his chauffeur to drive the car. He'd never driven a car in his life before, and he went headlong into a tree. Everybody was killed but me. And were it not for the fact that in those days they had tires strapped to the back of the car, and I, by a streak of fate, was tossed into the tire. I was a little bit of a skinny thing. I wouldn't be here to tell you the story. My life was saved. I never remembered that motor accident, although they questioned me. But the night in the lifeboat, every detail, the most gruesome and the most horrible of that accident came to me vividly. Every detail of the horror of that accident I remembered in detail in the lifeboat.
But carrying that pig, which became your mascot, how did you get from the Titanic into the lifeboat?
Well, I made up my mind I wasn't going to leave the ship. Bruce Ismay stood on B deck and kept calling out, "All women and children, come to B deck." I went up twice. It was so cold. I thought myself idiotic. I'm going back. And I went back twice to A deck and sat down until finally Bruce Ismay spied me, called out to me. He said, "All women and children." I thought had left the ship. "Come up here." And I walked up to B deck, and Bruce Ismay picked me up. Well, it was almost as if I was a rat terrier, and threw me down a little winding iron staircase. I fell down the iron staircase and found myself between a line of sailors on either side. And I looked down and found I'd lost one of my buckles on my shoe. I wanted that buckle. I was that much interested in the buckle and absolutely disinterested in anything pertaining to saving my life, because after all it was an unsinkable ship, you see. What could happen to me? Moreover, I had my little pig. Nothing could happen to me. So I walked along the rail, and I found a gentleman standing at the rail. Strangely enough, the very gentleman that I had told on the tender that I was frightened to take the Titanic. And he said to me, "Hello, come on, you're going to get off of this ship." I said, "Not me. How do you expect me to get off of anything with this thing I've got on? I'm a prisoner in my own skirt. I can't even walk, much less get up to that rail and then jump across the ocean into a lifeboat. Oh, no, not me. I'm not an acrobat." Well, he said, "You'll have to." And as I stood there arguing with him, and I had my little pig, mind you, under my arm, it was white, under my arm, a sailor came along. He said, "Yeah, now you can do as you want, but I'm going to save your baby." And he grabbed the pig, threw it into the lifeboat. So I turned around to Mr. Monk and I said, "That settles it. Here I go. I don't know how I'm going to go, but I've got to go. I'm going to follow that pig. I promised my mother." Well, he may have thought I was insane. Nobody knew what the pig meant to me. So he made a cradle of his hands with another gentleman. I sat on his hands, put my arms around his neck, and he threw me head foremost through space. And I fell on the bottom of the boat and kept looking and looking for my pig. I found him with his broken, poor little legs broken, and his nose gone. Well, made me feel very badly, but I kind of turned him. I found he was still playing music, so that was all right.
Can you remember how many of you there were in the lifeboat?
Yes. I've managed to find a place on the gunwale and found that I was the next to last passenger in the last lifeboat and the only lifeboat that was full. 68 passengers, about 1/3 of them nearly children. That was the only lifeboat that carried the children.
And how long before you were picked up?
Well, as we left the ship, the fall lines were knotted. They cut them with a knife. We struck the water. I think it was 10 minutes to 2 or 5 minutes to 2. The ship stood there fully lighted, absolutely lighted, music playing. We heard that in the lifeboat. We still saw the lighted ship alongside. In our lifeboat, we had 3 sets of oars, perfectly useless. The ocean was just as flat, well, as your bathtub. I never saw a lake quite that flat. Inky black night, starlit, and not a ripple in the sea. And the kind of cold, well, if you want to know what kind of cold it is, just open your Frigidaire door, take a seat inside and shut the door, and you'll know what it felt like. The kind of cold that your skin seemed to congeal. Now there I was, with nothing on practically, silk stockings, no underwear, no nothing, just about freezing to death. I sat on the gunwale, and the children were crying and whimpering. It suddenly struck me, I believe I'll play music, and then the little children maybe will be diverted and amused. And there I sat, and all night long I played the machich. And the poor little children were so interested in the music box that most of them stopped crying. Excepting one little fellow. He squealed like a pig. And strangely enough, years later, only a few years ago, there was a reunion of Titanic survivors in New York. Very few of us. And a great big strapping 6-footer came up to me. I believe he said he was a grandfather. Said to me, I was one of the babies in your lifeboat. And I said, well, I don't recognize you. You look so different today. He said, yes, I'm grown up now. But my mother's here. And then I remembered that that little baby had been thrown by his mother in the wastebasket, and she just walked off the ship, took a lifeboat, forgot all about the baby, and only remembered when she got on the Carpathia that she ever did have a baby. And were it not for the stewardess that heard a whimpering in the wastebasket in one of the cabins, that 6-footer would not have been there to talk to me. So that's the only time I've ever been reunited with one of the babies.
And how long was it before the Carpathia picked you up?
Well, we left the ship at 10 minutes to 2. It was 5 minutes to 8, they told me. we got alongside of the Carpathia the next morning. And at that time, Bruce Ismay pulled up alongside in a lace-frilled shirt, black trousers with stripes, braids down, no overcoat, not dressed, and not in a lifeboat, as people claim, standing up in the last collapsible raft. And he came alongside a few minutes after we, the last lifeboat, pulled alongside of the Carpathia. I boarded the Carpathia around about 8 o'clock. They put us on little wooden planks with a rope around us. I think they call it boatswain's cradles or something of that kind. I'm not very up on nautical terms. I ought to be, but I'm not.
Have you ever traveled by boat since?
I only traveled by ship. I never will travel by airplane. And I've traveled time and again since. And Franklin of the White Star made me return 6 months later in the same cabin with the same setup so that I would not be frightened and I would never be conscious on an ocean steamer. But after the Titanic, on the same White Star line, I was on the Majestic when she broke in half, and I was on the Olympic when she struck a tidal wave. As a matter of fact, a great many of the captains sort of avoided me, and I often wonder if the Titanic could have escaped me. I really believe sometimes I sunk the Titanic.